All right, folks, it is 3 o'clock my time now that we've switched back over to Eastern Standard Time. Where are we? Let's get started here. First of all, just so that you can see me, hi, I am live and I am a real person. So, we're going to continue the fun that that you guys have been having here all day, and we're going to talk about cloud for the next hour or so. And really, we're going to talk about it from the perspective of like what it actually is and what it actually isn't, since many people sort of confuse the cloud for very weird and interesting things. So without further ado, let's get going with that. Um, I sort of start the session always by saying, remember when HD came out and, everybody all of a sudden was saying, oh yeah, this is HD. I remember washing machines coming out saying whatever model it was, but it was the HD model. For those of you who are in the Toronto area and stuff like that, and you hear on the radio, there's one particular doctor who's doing HD vision. And it's kind of like it became this new buzzword that everybody was saying, hey, this is HD, which really just meant that A, it's cool, which is great in and of itself. But B, it meant that it was something that sort of everybody wanted. And what happened with cloud when it kind of came out was the same thing, right? So all of a sudden, what ended up happening is, there are different service providers out there, or even different consumer things that are saying, "Hey, we're a cloud," or you see commercials on TV, store your stuff in the cloud, and that while that's technically true. I wouldn't quite say it's entirely true. So today we're gonna demystify that, and we're gonna look at what actually is the cloud, but more importantly, how you guys as developers can leverage it to do a whole bunch of cool things with your application. Now, when we talk about these clouds, really we talk about three particular challenges in general when you're considering these things. The first, and I mean you guys are all developers, so you're going to side with me very quickly on this one. Scenario for you, right? You're going in, you're working on a brand new application. Your client, whoever that might be, internal or external to your company, comes up to you and says, "Hey, I need this application up and running in a couple of hours." And you're like, okay, well, that's great, but where do I put it? And then you go over to your IT people and they say, well, for us to get you a server, for us to get you somewhere to put it, is going to take some time. It'll take a couple of weeks, and get over it, sort of is what it came down to. So that's a kind of challenge for us developers to say, well, okay, where do we put our applications? Now, granted, you can say, yeah, we can go and get, a traditional hosting account, and, for $10 a month, we can put our application on there. Yeah, makes sense. And there are certain scenarios where you would do that, but let's think bigger. Let's think applications that are for people all around the world, and more importantly, are for lots of people at all times. And obviously, when you're building applications and when you're building, solutions like that, that's sort of what you want to get your mind around, right? You heard Paul talking about applications on the phone, and that's really what I'm talking about. So applications that have that massive scale, you're not going to go and put it on a traditional hosting account. And we'll get into further detail in a little bit. Just wanted to make sure that we go through these challenges so that you really get a context of why this stuff actually makes sense. Next challenge. How many of you see this picture and say, yeah, I'm a developer. I don't want to deal with those, and or they scare me or stuff like that. Yeah, and that's right. As developers, we don't want to deal with infrastructure. It's actually quite simple. We like to code. And so when we code, we should do nothing but code. So it's like, okay, great. Somewhere and somehow I need to be able to put my applications and not have to worry about this infrastructure. So that's challenge number 2. Challenge number 3, and this one I know you guys are going to love, but from a development perspective, how many times have you had to do the same thing over and over and over again? Or really wished that you had building blocks that were kind of there that you could use when you go and you build an application, right? So that's really yet another one of those challenges where it's like, you're scratching your head saying, okay, so my traditional hosting account gives me somewhere to put my apps. Okay, great. But I need all of these additional features so that I don't have to worry about it every time before I go developing an application. It's like, it takes more time and more effort unnecessary. You want something that has, those building blocks for you so that, you're not worried about all these things. And it's actually that simple. So now that you kind of have those three in mind and keep those in mind as we go through this, let's sort of look at what a typical application looks like today. Right, so we have a server, simple enough, right? On top of that server, we have an operating system, and within that operating system, we have where our application actually sits, right? Relatively straightforward. Now, most applications these days would work with something called a database, and that database is most likely going to sit on a very similar type of infrastructure, right? You have a server, you have an operating system, and on top of that, you have your database. Cool. So nothing special there. All of which have to exist in some sort of building, right? So some sort of data center. And you're assuming and you're hoping that someone is going to manage these so that not only are you up when you need to be up, but that you're also, secure and nobody's tinkering with your application, especially if you're saving data. So you don't want to go in there. And in a traditional application, if you're just, traditional hosting, or hey, it's in your own data center, or better yet, it's in a computer, underneath your desk in your basement, all of these things at the end of the day are actually up to you to manage. So when we go back to thinking about those challenges we were talking about before and saying, okay, well, that in and of itself doesn't work, or that is the challenge, right? It's not what I want to be doing, but yet I have to do that. So if we look at what a cloud application is, and this is sort of one of those aha moments that I had at the beginning when I started talking about these things, is that when someone says cloud, for whatever reason, I guess maybe because it's new or relatively new, there is this thought that, it's this impossible thing, it's going to be really difficult for me to move my apps there, so on and so forth. So here I am, and we're gonna do a little bit of the same scenario that we did before, right? We're gonna draw a cloud. So we have our cloud. Now we have the same server as we had before. Now the only difference is that it's not in my building anymore or in my data center. It's actually in the data center of your chosen provider, right? So now you've taken out this concept of you having to worry about the infrastructure. Cool. Challenge. One of the challenges taken care of. Now, what happens when I need to, when my application goes viral and I need a whole bunch of additional power to make my application work, right? Again, in the cloud now, you have this ability to go in and say, okay, well, because I'm not actually worried about this infrastructure anymore, and because I can actually get it when I want it, which we're going to get to in a second, I can have a whole bunch of these just sitting there and hosting my application. And then very similarly, you're still going to have that database. So you're still going to need something very similar to that to work with, that as your application grows, your database grows. But if you look at the general sort of architecture of how these things are, nothing's changed. You still have the same concept of a server application, operating system and then application. Good. So the big things that have in fact changed is the fact that now your building and your management are not your problem. More importantly, in this particular case, they're Microsoft's problem, right? So that's actually, I don't know, for me as a developer, it's like, okay, so I have a big name behind the infrastructure of my applications. Chances are I'm going to be okay to trust that company to make sure that I am in fact up all the time. And not like Thomas was saying, when you're up at night, I'm talking about your applications being up, but you're also secure, and you're also benefiting from the fact that there's a lot of hardware that we have in our data centers. And so rather than you having to worry about the hardware, let us worry about the hardware for you, and you could just use it, right? And then when you're done using it, you return it back to us, and when you want it back again, we give you some more. Relatively simple stuff, and yet somehow and for some reason, everybody looks at this cloud thing as a very, very scary thing. So hopefully when you guys leave this hour, you'll come back to me and say, yeah, you know what, it's actually not that scary. So let's see how all of this actually addresses the three challenges, and this is really cloud computing in general. We talked about time to market as the challenge. Well, great, fine. In this particular case, we have on-demand hardware, right? So I go in and I say, for my application today, I need one web server, but tomorrow I need four. Great. Go into my little management portal and say I need four. Hit save, and there you go. You have four servers now, putting up your application. And the best part of it, in order to do that without all of this happening in the background or without cloud computing there for you, who's going to do it? It would have been you that would have had to go put the servers in place and connect the network and all that kind of stuff. So no longer do you have to do that. The next challenge, we talked about having to deal with the infrastructure, right? And the beauty of this whole concept is that everything is automated. And what isn't 100% automated is all done through management and wizards. So you're literally going through and clicking your way through actually building a network, and you haven't ever touched a piece of hardware yourself. Again, I don't know about you guys, but from a developer perspective, this is like being on cloud nine, right? Not having to worry about all this stuff is just fantastic. And then from the last challenge, right? We as developers, and hopefully you guys aren't going to get mad at me for saying this, but let's be honest. For us developers, we like to be lazy. Some people call it lazy, some people call it efficient. It doesn't really matter. The point is that we want to make sure that we have the tools in place to make all of this stuff easy. But more importantly, those building blocks exist outside of our application so that we don't have to worry every time about, recreating the wheel or hell, creating our own frameworks to reuse every time. Why not just use ones that are standard, right? So with all of that, moving to a cloud model, you then get everything we just talked about plus a whole bunch more. You see their scale, right? So for those of you who aren't familiar with that concept, that's really the ability to grow from something tiny, right? Like you're just starting with one server, let's say, or one copy of your application. And again, you connected it to your Facebook, or you're having a Facebook campaign, and then all of a sudden, one person likes it and tells their friends, 10 people come, and then 100 people come, and then 100,000 people come. You kind of need to be able to deal with all of that additional stress on your site. Then on top of that, we say, okay, well, it used to be that we used to design for, let's say, you live in North America, great. So you would assume that your market is North America. But now we're really building stuff for the world. And more importantly, and you'll see in the next session, when we go a little bit deeper with Atlassian and devices, everybody's carrying a device. And even Thomas was talking about it, right? It's all about devices these days. And so those devices travel with people. And so you have to make sure that your application is giving that seamless experience regardless of where that person is. The next big one is really the fact that when you're putting together these things, more often than not, you have to pay up front, especially if you're building a business app or a relatively larger application where you're going to go ahead and you're going to buy your own dedicated servers. Or actually, I was just having a conversation the other day with a developer, and he was saying to me, yeah, I have a virtual private server. I'm like, okay, so yeah, it's virtual, great, but aren't you still managing the infrastructure in that case? He's like, well, yeah. I'm like, but why? And more importantly, he's like, I had to pay setup fees, and I have to pay ahead of time whether I use, the full potential of my virtual server or not. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but why? Right? And especially if you're trying to build a company, so let's say you're a startup, or you're trying to take an application that you don't know whether it's going to work, so you don't want to spend too much time in it, or too much money, I should say. You don't want to deal with all that stuff up front. So point is, with cloud computing and the cloud platforms, you only pay for what you use, and that's really the beauty of it. Now, you heard me say before, who's going to guarantee that it's up and who's going to care about the fact that it's secure and protected, so on and so forth. Okay, well, there you go. When you go to a cloud provider, you're going to get that out of the box. So it's a whole bunch of different things like that really, at the end of the day, the theme that I'm trying to get to is those three challenges. You want to make sure that you get your stuff up as soon as humanly possible. You want to be lazy and sort of just deal with what you do best, and that's great. That's the way it should be. You are developers, so you should code. And then the last one is really having the tools in place. So let's actually, we'll go a little bit into that in a little bit, but before we do that, you're gonna be like, okay, well, that's great, but what applications actually need all this fancy stuff that you're talking about? And when we talk about those types of applications, it really boils down to these kind of main categories. The website one is sort of a given, but I'll go through it anyway. It's basically, think about you're having, you have a shop or an online e-commerce site, and it's coming up on the holiday season. You're going to have a lot of sales, and so you want to make sure that you're able to handle those, right? So you're going to go in and you're going to say, okay, I'm anticipating a lot more traffic, so give me more horsepower, give me more juice. And so that kind of makes sense from a website's perspective. That really caters to scale. But what about if you're running a gaming application? Actually, I'm not going to do that. That one's for a later one. But let's say you're running a company that actually has a presence both in North America and in Europe. Well, why make your European users travel all the way through, the oceans and stuff like that to hop on to North America to get to a North American data center? You can actually put your web applications wherever your users are, right? So it gives them that much of a better experience as they're going through. So that's really why you would do it for websites. Where we're really seeing sort of like the hotness factor come in is when it comes to mobile apps, right? Everybody's building a mobile app these days, and you should. Just because, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I don't really carry any other device other than my phone. And you heard Paul go into how to make phone apps successful and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, by adding sort of additional services, backend services to your mobile applications, you can get it to do a whole lot more. I'm not going to touch too much on that one because Atlee's actually going to go over it in the next session. But the idea being there that you have a mobile application, more often than not, the mobile applications don't necessarily just interact with themselves. It's not a closed world after all, so you need that backend. And especially with mobile applications, and very similar to devices, which is that next category, those devices actually move around the globe, and you're going to need to make sure that you're going to give the user the same experience regardless of where they are, right? So by putting a cloud backend on your applications, you're going to be able to do that, and give them that experience. Similar to websites, when we're talking about huge volumes of usage and a lot of people coming in, are social apps, right? So think about applications like the ones connected to Facebook, or like the ones connected to Twitter, LinkedIn, and whatever social network has sort of like a plugin framework. And again, from the perspective of it can go viral, which means that you can go from 1 to 100,000 people in a matter of a day, and you need to make sure that you take that into account. But more importantly, your users that are going to come to these social applications are coming from a provider that in and of themselves are actually giving them that experience, that speedy experience. So Facebook, for example, is not hosting your application. They're just redirecting it and building it into its frame, right? So if someone's coming from Facebook and they have that sort of experience from Facebook that, everything's speedy and responsive, they're going to come to your app and it's slow. What do you think is going to happen? They're going to stop using it, right? And that's just a fact. Speed is a must. So that's an example for social apps. When we talk about social games, one of the key sort of differentiators there for social games is the fact that when you're talking social games, you're talking real-time interaction, right? So think, you're working with you're playing a game on your Xbox, or you're playing a game on your phone with other people, right? And you do something and they immediately need to respond, right? All of that connection back and forth is all real time. And so you need to make sure that you have an infrastructure that is able to actually, connect everybody with that experience in mind, and more importantly, again, grow as your particular game grows. It's actually a really good example of this one. If you go to tankster.net, that's actually an HTML5 based application that, I should say game, that's using a cloud backend, Windows Azure in this case, to kind of scale up to hundreds of thousands of users at the same time. And another part of social games is actually the fact that you can connect from multiple different devices, right? So you can have, in the case of Tankster, you have a web front end, you have a phone front end, you have a desktop front end, right? So all that kind of stuff needs to connect to somewhere, and so they're using the cloud backend in order to do that. So again, we're developers, right? So we need to see what this actually is all about. So let's go in and actually see, the bits and pieces. And I was going to say pardon the pun, but the pun there with the bits is actually quite intentional, right? You want to see what it's all about. Now, when it comes to talking about cloud platforms, there are in fact only a few that are actually real cloud platforms, right? So it's not like, everything that exists on the internet, like I started off by saying, is not in the cloud, right? So in this particular case, of course, what are we talking about? We're talking about Windows Azure, and how you could use this platform, to kind of take into account all of those different things that we were talking about for the different types of applications that you can write using Windows Azure as a backend. So what does the platform actually look like? Remember, I was talking to you about all of these different tools that you can use, and the idea with the tools is that rather than you having to constantly code the same thing over and over and over again, or being able to do things self-service when you want them and how much of it you want, that's sort of how the platform breaks down. So when you look at something like compute, right, that's your actual horsepower. Think of that as your actual server that's hosting your application. And that's what I was talking to before, in that you can go in and say, today I want 1, tomorrow I want 4, and then the day after that I want to go back to 2, right? So you can play with that. When we look at storage, now this one is a big one, especially for the devices, because devices at the end of the day only have a fixed amount of storage, right? And granted, you can put in memory cards and so on and so forth, but at the end of the day, it's fixed. So as people are using your application, and this is especially the case with games, as they're saving game data or potentially additional levels or anything like that, you need somewhere to put it, right? So rather than worrying about putting it on the device, ship it up to Windows Azure, and now all of a sudden you have infinite amount of space in order to put your the data that you need for your application. Now, if you're more traditional and you don't want to necessarily go with, before I go to and do that, actually, from a storage perspective, that's actually 2 types of storage. There's data storage, and that's sort of like NoSQL, where, you have somewhere to put your stuff and there's no fixed schema, which actually makes it brilliantly easy to store data and get at data. But at the same time, you also have blob storage, which allows you to actually just put, binary files up there, and storing videos and images or documents or whatever it is that your application needs. You could just put that all in there. The other big thing about that one is that you're going to put in there files that you think are going to change very quickly. So you'd actually, or very often, you'd actually put in there your CSS files, your JavaScript files, all the ones that you need very quick access to, because packaging those up with your application into your compute can get a little bit more difficult. We're not going to get into the technicalities here, but I do have some next steps for you afterwards that we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. When we think databases, right? So this one's a really cool one because there's a whole bunch of different options. There's SQL Azure that you can use if you're used to working with SQL Server, but there's now also support for MongoDB if you're used to working with that, or if you prefer, you technically could get MySQL to work as well, though not necessarily as easy as the other 2. From a compute perspective, I forgot to mention, one of the big myths that exists about Windows Azure is that, because it's a Microsoft platform, and because it says Windows, everybody automatically assumes, well, okay, great, so it's only .NET. Interestingly enough, the truth is that it's actually not. And you can do a whole bunch of different languages, and different technologies are also supported in the platform. So like things like MongoDB, which is not a Microsoft product, is supported. Things like PHP or Memcached or Solr and different things like that, those are all, or even Hadoop is actually supported there as well. So you're kind of getting the idea that it's a platform that's open for you to use whatever you want to use. It's really just providing you the support there for you to be able to use the tools that you already know, the technologies that you already know, without having to say, well, if I'm going to switch over to Windows Azure, then I'm going to have to go ahead and change everything, right? So not the case. Myth busted. Don't worry about it. Let's now accept that and think, yes, we're open, and move on. Content delivery network is actually really cool when you're talking about websites, when you're talking about mobile apps, when you're talking about device apps, and any kind of place where you have data that needs to be put all over the world. And really what it is, it's this network of nodes that we have that allows you to place sort of large things, like images or videos and stuff like that close to your user, as opposed to having them keep coming back to the data center to get the data. And then it kind of keeps a copy there for the next person to get it as well. So for that second person that's requesting the same thing, it's even faster. Right? And that really allows you, again, to get that geographic distribution very easily. And the best part about that one, zero setup, right? Basically, you're going to go into your management portal and say, turn it on. It's going to spit out a URL, and you start using that URL, and you're good to go. That's it. Simple as that. VPN is really if you have to have sort of like a hybrid solution where there's certain pieces of your application that you have to keep somewhere. You can't put that up in Windows Azure. You can use VPN to connect the two together by sort of creating a tunnel between them that's secure so that they actually do think that they're on the same network. Now, with web applications and stuff like that, I haven't seen that one used too much, but just so that you know that it is in fact there. On the BI side, let's say you have a whole bunch of data that you're working with and you want to run some reports, say like transactions in a store, or you're tracking video usage or whatever it might be. Rather than, again, having to write a reporting engine, you can actually use the BI tools that come with SQL Azure Reporting to do that for you. From a service bus perspective, that one is relatively simple from the concept that it's not any different than an enterprise service bus or a service bus pattern that you would know from today. The beauty of that one, again, that one is what I was talking about before, is a tool that sort of exists as a service so that you don't have to worry about the infrastructure to put that one in place. You could connect to it from two completely separate places, right? And what it does is you put the message up on the bus on the one side, you put the message, you listen on the other hand, you say this message goes to this place, done, right? Again, the beauty of that, all configuration based through a web browser. And from a code perspective, you're maybe looking at a couple of lines of code, which is great. Access control is actually my favorite. And the reason for that is because this is one of those services that I know when I was developing applications, I absolutely hated creating login forms and creating forgot your password forms and having to manage all that and then worrying about, well, what if my site gets compromised, so on and so forth. Point is, not good. With access control, all of that is actually outsourced out of your application. And now all of a sudden, with a simple API call into the access control, it actually takes all of that functionality, you redirect your application into the access control, it does all the authentication and authorization for you and sends it right back. What you get back is a claims token that says, yep, I know who this person is. And from your perspective, that's all you're storing. So let's say even somehow, some way, someone was actually able to get into your data. That claim means nothing to them because it didn't go through that process beforehand. The other really cool part about that one is that you can actually use a whole bunch of different authentication providers and you don't even have to use your own, right? So things like Windows Live or your Yahoo ID or your Facebook ID, or if you're working with Active Directory, then you can even use that to federate between your on-premise Active Directory and your cloud application, so that for your web apps, let's say you're you're building an application for an enterprise environment, then your web application can actually look like it's tied to the infrastructure and not actually require anyone to log in again. So forget that one for a side. Let's focus on Windows Live, Yahoo, Facebook, and all those. Think about that, right? You simply by turning it on, you actually get all that functionality without actually having to code each one separately yourself. Whereas beforehand, you would have literally had to go in and say, okay, well, if I want to integrate with Facebook, here's the API, here's what I need to build as my application, blah, 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 blah. Here, one call into the access control, it takes care of everything for you. And the beauty of all of these, by the way, and that includes the database, the storage, the service bus, access control, and caching, which I'll talk about in a second, all of these are REST-based services. So what does that mean? It means that very simply, any device or any program that has an internet connection that I can understand or that can talk web services can use all of these, and you don't need any other tools, you don't need any other applications. Which, if you think about it, technically you could even make your Blu-ray player connect into a Windows Azure backend, and all of a sudden now you've enabled all of these additional features simply because the device had internet connectivity. So that's some really powerful stuff, as opposed to some of the other platforms that sort of make you use very proprietary pieces of software or languages and so on and so forth. So just keep that in mind when you're using all of these tools, or when you're thinking about using all these tools. The last one that I want to talk about there is caching, and that one's really, if you think about performance, you think about, I need to make sure that people get to stuff fast, or you're thinking about, I'm going to use 4 or 5 different copies of my application, and I need them to, have a consistent session across. Well, I need to put that stuff somewhere. And granted, I could put it in a database, but caching is so much faster because it's an in-memory process, right? So it doesn't have all that latency to go back and write to a database server, so on and so forth. So why do you care about all this stuff, especially for web applications? Like, this stuff is gold, because you could literally just put it up there, and it being whatever you want, data, text, doesn't matter. Anything that you need very quick access to, stick it up there in cache. And then when you bring it down, again, it's like literally instantaneous. And because all of these are services, they're going to increase in scale or decrease in scale based on what you need it to do without you having to even get involved, which to me is sort of like the cherry on top. Again, as a developer, I don't want to have to deal with these things. And it's actually literally that simple, that as long as I'm using it, Windows Azure takes care of all the scaling and stuff like that for me. So now we are all developers again, right? So we need some developer talk. All of that stuff was all infrastructure and why, but it matters. It matters because we need to get our minds around what it is that we're working. When you take it down to the development experience, very simple. Platform supports .NET, Java, PHP, Ruby, Node.js. I've seen even people get it to work with C++. If you really wanted to, somewhat a little bit more difficult configuration. Technically, you could also do ASP, like classic ASP. But the idea is all of the new types of languages, or all the popular languages that are now available, absolutely supported by the platform. Which, of course, if you think about it, is really cool, because if you have a PHP-based application, using Windows Azure doesn't mean you're going to go and rewrite it. And for me, when I'm talking to developers, kind of like an eye-opener to say, yeah, you know what, I can actually lift my application from its current infrastructure and move it over. So just wanted to make sure to call that out. Now, the nice thing about you being able to use all of these different platforms is not actually the fact that you can, but more importantly, the tools that make it happen. So if you're a .NET developer, you have the Windows Azure SDK, you got Windows Azure tools for Visual Studio. And if you are a Visual Studio user, then man, the functionality that you get in Visual Studio is insane, like testing and deployments and all that kind of stuff are right from within Visual Studio. Beauty of it is, you can even use the free Visual Studio, which actually comes with the Windows Azure SDK download. Now, if you're a Java person, not a problem. You have an SDK of your own as well. And now, actually, I forgot to put it in there, but there's actually Eclipse plugins as well that give you pretty much the same experience that you would get from Visual Studio now for Java developers using Eclipse. So that one's really cool too. By the way, all of these toolkits that I'm talking about here and all the tools are open source, so you could technically download them and expand them as you wish based on the kind of functionality that you're looking for. You PHP developers, you got an SDK of your own as well. You have a whole bunch of command line tools that you can use that come in the SDK to really make all the stuff easy. WordPress, for example, there's scaffolds, which is basically almost like templates that you could download that makes it easy to put WordPress up in Azure. Just the idea being with all of these toolkits is really just to make it that simple, right? Ruby, same thing. Mobile. Of course, mobile. Again, I keep telling you, mobile apps is sort of one of the biggest uses for Windows Azure. So if you're a Windows Phone developer, you got a toolkit for that. If you're an iOS developer, yeah, that's right, you have a toolkit for that. And again, Android, you have a toolkit for that. Those toolkits give you all the code that you need to actually literally pop it into your application, start using it, and you're good to go. Fully ready objects, There's also sample code in there as well, which is cool. And there's documentation, of course, to make sure that you're able to use it. If you're building social apps, there's a toolkit for that as well that really kind of gives you that underpinning of, things like how do I make sure that I could do real-time communications back and forth. If you're a SharePoint developer, there's even a toolkit for that. Again, the idea, let's make this stuff simple for you to use. So what's next, right? I've been talking and it's been great. And I'm going to flip over to the chat in a second and see what kind of questions you have for me. But just to make sure that you know what you need to go do next after you hear this and you're like, hey, yeah, I do have an app idea that can use that. Or maybe you're already working on an application that you'd be like, yeah, you know what? I can move it over here. How do I get started with all this stuff? That's really where, the rubber hits the road, if you will. I could talk about this stuff as much as you want me to talk about it. I guarantee you it will not sort of sink in until you actually kind of get past the concepts and go try this stuff out yourself. Now, this used to be a 30-day trial. Now it's actually a 90-day trial, so 3 months gives you plenty of time to try this stuff out. And it is, in fact, free. Yes, you have to put in a credit card, but it actually has automatic spending limits that basically prevents any charges going to your credit card. So just to put it out there. The tools, of course, I mentioned are free regardless of what the platform is. So you want to make sure that you get those. And when you go into that link there, bit.ly get Azure tools, by the way, those are case sensitive. Then you can actually take the language of your choice and you kind of download what you're looking for and you literally just start using it. Now, all that is fine and dandy, and let's say you don't necessarily have an application that you can go put this in right away. I put together, in the spirit of camps, right? So here you're at a Webcamp. Well, Azure sort of deserves a camp all on its own because there's a whole bunch of things that you can learn there. So what I did was I have prepped for you guys all of this stuff online where I actually go through in much deeper context of what Azure is and all the different pieces to it. And we go into some code and demos in there as well. 5 different sessions that cover the platform, and that's the URL there. Again, remember, it is in fact case sensitive. The big thing about the Windows Azure camps there is that actually it has hands-on labs. So as you're going through the different parts of the platform and you're watching the different sessions that come with the Azure camp that I've put up there for you, you actually can then take what you learned in the video and then take the hands-on lab and actually try it out yourself with the trial that you signed up for. And Azure Camp is actually available in person as well if you prefer to come and do it in person. There's usually a whole bunch of experts that are doing it throughout the country. When you go there, you can actually, there's a link to in-person camps and you can check out where the closest one is to you and when it is. And of course, it wouldn't be, it wouldn't be a camp if there wasn't free stuff, right? So I have to make sure, other than your badges, I got to make sure that I tell you about this particular challenge because it does have free stuff associated with it. What is it? It is the Windows Azure challenge. Basically, it's about learning and then rewarding yourself with some free stuff. So if you go to azurecamp.ca/AC challenge, basically very simple. You download the introductory hands-on lab. It literally walks through some of the things that I talked about today in terms of that putting up a compute and then making it grow and then shrink and all that kind of fun stuff. Shouldn't take you too long to do. If you're reading line by line, it might, but the nice thing is, depending on how you learn, there's actually the ability, I've included in the zip file for you, the completed lab. So if you're the type of developer that likes to kind of see it done and then work backwards, you'll have that in there as well. Now, how do you get your free stuff? Very simple. You've signed up for the trial already because, of course, you wanted to play with this stuff, right? And you deploy the lab to Windows Azure. Again, it won't cost you anything if you're doing the trial. And then all you got to do is you got to send me your screenshots. Very simple. 2 screenshots that you got to take for me, just so that I can see that you actually did in fact complete the lab. And then what do? I send you a reward just to say thank you. And then you could take yourself out for a couple of drinks, and to enjoy it on my behalf, just because you learned something new. For those of you that are or prefer to do stuff in PHP, you can actually download the Azure PHP samples at the URL that I have on the screen there for you. And then that way you could actually do the lab in PHP if that is what you prefer.